Hey guys, Tyler here. Now, for this video, I'm gonna respond to Ben Shapiro because more recently he did a video talking about secularism and there was like a lot of misinformation in that video. So, let's check out the video and I'll give my personal reactions and responses to his video.
Look at the rise of secularism, and non-affiliated is the #1 group of millennials. We're watching.
That is true. Basically, according to Pew data, like people who happen to be Christian nowadays are like 60% of the population, whereas like people who are like non-religious are probably also I think 20-30% of the population. So I think according to the data at least, that is actually true, that there are actually more and more people who are actually more non-religious. However, I want to further emphasize that it's entirely possible for a person, very entirely possible, for them to not, be like an atheist and secular, because this whole entire idea of secularism is wanting to have separation of church and state. So it's entirely possible to be an atheist and be in favor of separation of church and state. It's also entirely possible for somebody to be a Christian or a Muslim or any number of religious groups and be secular. So this idea that, of course, this is actually some sort of atheist phenomenon is not true, when in reality anybody, and I do mean anybody, can support the idea of separation of church and state.
Younger people basically rejecting religion wholesale. We're seeing organized religion.
Yeah, the main reason why more and more people are kind of rejecting religion is because we live in an age of information. People can look at holy texts like the Bible or the Quran or any number of holy texts online for free and come up with their own personal conclusions. And if a number of people have their own personal conclusions on whether or not these texts are true or not, basically that comes down to their own personal choices and their own personal decision. If somebody reads the exact same text and want to become religious, that's fine. But for most part, like many people read the text and come to the conclusion that is not entirely for them. So, with that being said, of course, like it's entirely possible to reject the mainstream religion, but also, of course, have, some sort of spirituality without religious buildings. So, it's entirely possible to, not be religious, but also be spiritual.
In decline by statistics. Why do you think that is, particularly given the fact that after several decades of an increasingly secular America, it is obvious that there are pretty dire social effects to exactly that sort of secularization?
What kind of dire effects are you talking about? Because back when, of course, United States had, slavery, it was heavily inspired by many parts of the Bible to say to, of course, keep slaves. And obviously many people use the parts about slavery in the Bible to justify slavery. And of course, they also use the Bible to not justify slavery and actually liberate the slaves. And of course, the whole entire idea of women liberation, of course, that was not obviously inspired by the Bible. Because again, the Bible talks about how basically women should be silent in church and actually be submissive to their husbands. So this idea that somehow because we rejected religious belief in favor of more secular ones is not true, because there's not any sort of dire consequences as a result of people becoming more liberated for black people or for women, and of course anything else really.
Particularly in some of the more hard-hit Rust Belt areas, that when churches disappear, so does the social fabric, and we've seen opioid epidemics and
I'm kind of curious, just because, of course, church disappear doesn't mean that people can't find a sense of communities. It's entirely possible, very, very possible, to have the exact same things that you have without going to a religious building. For example, there's entire, community centers where people can go and play basketball, play any kind of sports, participate in activities, talk to people, make new friends, of course, make music, and so these kind of community centers can actually be entirely possible without the guide of organized religion. Not to mention, there's also, of course, the idea that, of course, morality does not come directly from, like, religion, because prior to Christianity, like, of course, there was, like, whole entire, like, commandments from the Code of Hibarashi and so on that actually predates the whole entire religion. So this idea that, of course, morality comes directly from religion, again, is also very much nonsensical. So let's continue on with his list, because apparently he listed like opioids as evidence of course, the crime of religion and stuff. So let's go.
Broken lives, we've seen epidemics of suicide.
Now, on the issue of suicide, of course, there's like a lot of different factors. However, just because people don't want to have, of course, like religion and church together, does not mean that's actually proof of suicide. For starters, where's your evidence that, of course, the lack of religion and government and secularism actually causes suicide? Because I haven't seen any sort of studies, none whatsoever, that actually prove that, of course, because of secularism, there's more suicides. Like, for example, during this whole entire crisis, of course, people are very much unemployed right now. And so basically, because of unemployment, that also drives to suicides. There's also the case for men, where basically in this country, there's like a lot of injustice for them, where they cannot, of course, divorce without having their stuff being taken from the woman. Of course, the lack of men's rights for this country, where basically there's like more women having more rights for like their own personal gender than, of course, men. So there's probably like a number of factors on why people are committing suicide. A lack of religion does not mean you can also commit suicide. Correlation, of course, does not equal causation.
Disconnection. But why has secularism been on the rise, despite the fact that there's been such obvious evidence of dire consequences?
Well, secularism. First of all, let's go back to talk about the decline of the church. I'm not sure the church is in decline. I think there are some mainline denominations that quit preaching the Bible for some time. And
really, just really, because the majority of the churches that people go nowadays do in fact use the Bible as their basis for sources. Of course, there are some denominations that are more fundamentalist and actually take the Bible really literal. And there are some denominations that do not take it literal and actually treat it as allegory. Not to mention, of course, there's a whole entire denomination that's called like, what was it? Like, Universalism is actually the only denomination that I know that actually has the Bible and the Quran and these other sort of holy books. So basically, that's the only denominations of thousands and thousands and thousands of denominations that I know of anyway that actually replaces the Bible. Besides all that kind of stuff, of course, like the only church is, of course, the Universal Church, and of course, everybody else still freaking use the Bible.
People just quit attending those churches. What you see is a rise of...
Mostly because they probably are questioning the beliefs of the doctrine in the books. They also probably listening to the news about various cases of like, sex trafficking. And of course, all this kind of nonsense with the priests. And of course, the corruption where basically, of course, they try to pay off politicians to interfere in their elections. And of course, the whole entire idea of these people trying to buy these jet planes. And so there's like a lot of stuff, a lot of factors on probably why people are leaving in mass drones. And so basically it's not because of just secular ideas, but also a multitude of different factors.
Bible teaching churches where pastors just get up and they open up the Bible and say, let's read today what God's Word says, and they start teaching the Bible. Those churches are full. They're packed. People are hungry today. They want to know the Word of God. And secularism gives license for people to live as just about any kind of wicked life they want to.
I'm kind of curious because like the main reason why people also are rejecting religion in mass drones is because they try to think that religion has a whole entire freaking control about everything you do. Like people, and obviously for many good reasons, don't want a whole entire organization to tell them what to do, what not to do, because ultimately, if you tell people what to do, what not to do, what to do in bed, what not to do in bed, etc., they obviously are going to rebel against that. And so naturally, if you guys are probably wondering why people are leaving en masse, it's probably one of the reasons why they're leaving en masse, because basically, when it comes down to it, a lot of people within organized religions like Christianity, for example, are probably sexually deprived and probably cannot do a lot of fun stuff, mostly because there's like leaders and priests who are trying to tell them what to do, what not to do, how apparently homosexuality is very immoral. And so that's probably one of the good reasons why, again, people are leaving en masse because of that.
Without any consequences. And of course, that's very attractive. And a lot of people go that direction and say, oh, this is going to be fun. This is going to be great.
And it's fun and it's great for people not to control every single thing you do in your life. I like the idea of liberty, that you can take your own personal responsibility. And of course, obviously, there's consequences for everything that we do. However, for people to actually have control of what to do and what not to do actually adds a level of self-responsibility.
But there's an emptiness, and you're right, the suicide rate is just incredible. The problems that secularism brings.
Again, just because there's high rates of suicide does not mean it's because of secularism. And also, again, citation needed.
It doesn't give answers. It gives them this license to be free, but at the end of the day, they're not free, and they're slaves to sin.
You really think that using this whole entire argument for sin would actually, draw people to your arguments? I'm pretty sure there's probably different ways to argue your point without resorting to this idea of original sin. Because ultimately, I do not believe in this idea. Most people probably watching this video don't believe in this idea of original sin. So, if you really want to convince people to come to your side, using this idea of sin will not actually work against them.
And they want to be free. They want answers. They're searching and looking for something better, and they're not finding it. And I want people to know that what they're searching for is God. And if they put their trust in Him, He'll take that broken life and He'll put it together just like He did mine. And He'll use you and He'll forgive you and cleanse you and give you hope for the morning, hope for the next day. And how important we need today, we need that hope for the next day.
Major media in the United States have basically blamed evangelicals for getting involved in politics. They're very upset.
Well, that's because it's true. Because basically, for the most part, like what Donald Trump did in the White House was also attack, of course, the Johnson Amendment. Now, the Johnson Amendment, for those who don't know outside of America, basically is a whole entire amendment where it says that churches cannot be politically involved and sponsor candidates. However, because of Donald Trump trying to appeal to the evangelicals, obviously he attacked it, he weakened it, and of course now they can probably do whatever they want to now. So obviously, basically they're trying to flip this idea of separation of church and state already. So
with religious people being involved in politics, they say that this is religious theocracy. It seems to me that it's precisely...
Well, that's because there's actually examples of Christians actually trying to not respect this idea of separation of church and states. We've seen time and time again that a lot of these fundamental Christians want creationism together with science in schools. We've seen time and time again that, of course, there's like the 10 Commandments at these government buildings. And so basically, there are actually some people who do not want that separation of church and state. Like basically the main reason why so many people come to this country, like in the past, was to actually, have freedom and escape from religious persecution. And of course, what they're doing right now is the same thing that people in the past that wanted to come here tried to escape. So, not to mention, like, the founders were actually in favor of separation of church and states. There's like entire quotations of them saying that they want separation of church and state. Even the First Amendment says that there's no established religion.
The opposite of what actually happened. What actually happened is that there was a fairly wide social consensus on a wide variety of issues, and that the secular left in the 1960s basically broke those down, and evangelical Christians, like religious people of all stripes, basically stood up on their hind legs and said, well, no, you don't get to discard those social consensuses without any sort of evidence. When do you think it becomes incumbent on religious people to get involved in politics? Under one circumstance?
Dude! The vast majority of the population right now in the United States, you said it yourself earlier, are in fact Christians. Like 60 or 70% of people, depending on the data, are actually identified as Christians. And naturally, the majority of the politicians are also Christians. And so that means there's actually very, very few like non-believers as part of the political system in my country. Now, obviously, I think, of course, you need to actually vote based upon the politics of a person, the religion, but it's obvious, very, very obvious, that the majority of the politicians that work in this country are Christians. You cannot give me this sort of nonsense, this sort of idea that there's not enough Christians at all in the whole entire political system. But anyway, that's like the main points that I wanted to refute for this video. I hope you guys find it interesting. And of course, until next time, guys, take care.